Chapter 1. I wonder if there isn't a lot of bunkum in higher education. I never found that people who were learned in logarithms and other kinds of poetry were any quicker in washing dishes or darning socks. I've done a good deal of reading when I could, and I don't want to admit impediments to the love of books. But I've also seen lots of good practical folk spoiled by too much fine print. Reading sonnets always gives me hiccups, too. I never expected to be an author, but I do think there are some amusing things about the story of Andrew and myself, and how books broke up our placid life. When John Gutenberg, whose real name, so the professor says, is John Gooseflesh, borrowed that money to set up his printing press, he launched a whole lot of troubles on the world. Andrew and I were wonderfully happy on the farm until he became an author. If I could have foreseen all the bother his writings were to cause us, I would certainly have burnt the first manuscript in the kitchen stove. Andrew McGill, the author of those books everyone reads, is my brother. In other words, I am his sister, 10 years younger. Years ago, Andrew was a businessman, but his health failed, and so like many people in his storybooks, he fled to the country, or, as he called it, into the bosom of nature. He and I were the only ones left in an unsuccessful family. I was slowly perishing as a conscientious governess in the brownstone region of New York. He rescued me from that, and we bought a farm with our combined savings. We became real farmers, up with the sun and to bed with the same. Andrew wore overalls and a soft shirt and grew brown and tough. My hands got red and blue with soap suds and frost. I never saw a Redfern advertisement from one year's end to another, and my kitchen was a battlefield where I set my teeth and learned to love hard work. Our literature was government agriculture reports, patent, medicine almanacs, seedsman booklets, and Sears Roebuck catalogs. We subscribed to Farm and Fireside and read the serials aloud. Every now and then, for real excitement, we'd read something stirring in the Old Testament, that cheery old Jeremiah, for instance, of which Andrew was very fond. The farm did actually prosper after a while, and Andrew used to hang over the pasture bars at sunset and tell, by the way he smoked his pipe, just what the weather would bring the next day. As I have said, we were tremendously happy until Andrew got the fatal idea of telling the world how happy we were. I'm sorry to have to admit that he's always been rather a bookish man. In his college days he had edited the Students' Magazine, and sometimes he would get discontented with the Farm and Fireside serials and put down his bound volumes of the college paper. He would read me some of his youthful poems and stories and mutter vaguely about writing something one day. I was more concerned with sitting hens than with sonnets, and I'm bound to say I never took these threats very seriously. I should have been more severe. Then, Great-Uncle Philip died, and his carload of books came to us. He'd been a college professor, and years ago when Andrew was a boy, Uncle Philip had been very fond of him, had, in fact, put him through college. We were the only near relatives, and all those books turned up one fine day. That was the beginning of the end. If I had only known it. Andrew had the time of his life building shelves all around our living room. Not content with that, he turned the old hen house into a study for himself, put in a stove, and used to sit up there in the evenings after I'd gone to bed. The first thing I knew, he called the place Sabine Farm, although it had been known for years as Bog Hollow, because he thought it the literary thing to do. He used to take a book along with him when he drove over the red field for supplies. Sometimes the wagon would be 2 hours late coming home. Old Ben loafing along between the shafts and Andrew lost in his book. I didn't think much of all this, but I'm an easy-going woman, and as long as Andrew kept the farm going, I had plenty to do on my own hook. Hot bread and coffee, eggs and preserves for breakfast, soup and hot meat, vegetables, dumplings, gravy, brown bread and white, huckleberry pudding, Chocolate cake, buttermilk for dinner, muffins, tea, sausage rolls, blackberries and cream, and donuts for supper. That's the kind of menu I'd been preparing 3 times a day for years. I hadn't had time to worry about what wasn't my business. And then one morning, I caught Andrew doing up a big parcel for the postman. He looked so sheepish I had to ask him what it was. "I've written a book," said Andrew, and he showed me the title page. Paradise Regained by Andrew McGill. Even then I wasn't much worried, because of course I knew no one would print it. But Lord, a month or so later a letter came from the publisher accepting it. That's the letter Andrew keeps framed above his desk. Just to show how such things sound, I'll copy it here. This is the letter. To Cameron Jones and Company, Publishers, Union Square, New York. January 13, 1907. Dear Mr. McGill, we have read with singular pleasure your manuscript, Paradise Regained. There is no doubt in our minds that so spirited an account of the joys of sane country living should meet with popular approval, and with the exception of a few revisions and abbreviations, we would be glad to publish the book practically as it stands. We would like to have it illustrated by Mr. Tortoni, some of whose work you may have seen, and would be glad to know whether he could call upon you in order to acquaint himself with the local color of your neighborhood. We would be glad to pay you a royalty of 10% upon the retail price of the book, and we enclose duplicate contracts for your signature in case this proves satisfactory to you. Believe us, etc., etc. I have since thought that Paradise Lost would have been a better title for that book. It was published in the autumn of 1907, and since that time our life has never been the same. By some mischance, the book became the success of the season. It was widely commended as the gospel of health and sanity, and Andrew received in almost every mail offers from publishers and magazine editors who wanted to get a hold of his next book. It was almost incredible to what stratagem publishers would go to descend to influence an author. Andrew had written Paradise Regained, of the tramps who visit us, how quaint and appealing some of them are, and let me add, how dirty, and how we never turn away anyone who seems worthy. Would you believe it? In the spring after the book was published, a disreputable-looking vagabond with a knapsack, who turned up one day, blarneyed Andrew about his book and stayed overnight, announced himself at breakfast as a leading New York publisher. He had chosen this ruse in order to make Andrew's acquaintance. You can imagine that it didn't take long for Andrew to become spoiled at that rate. The next year he suddenly disappeared, leaving only a note on the kitchen table, and tramped all over the state for 6 weeks collecting material for a new book. I had all I could do to keep him from going to New York to talk to editors and people of that sort. Envelopes of newspaper cuttings used to come to him. He'd pore over them when he ought to have been plowing corn. Luckily, the mailman comes along about the middle of the morning when Andrew is out in the fields, so I used to look over the letters before he saw them. After his second book, Happiness and Hayseed, it was called, was printed, letters from publishers got so thick that I used to put them all in the stove before Andrew saw them, except those from Cameron Jones people, which sometimes held checks. Literary folk used to turn up now and then to interview Andrew, but generally I managed to head them off. But Andrew got to be less and less of a farmer and more of a literary man. He bought a typewriter. He would hang over the pig pen noting down adjectives for the sunset instead of mending the weather vane on the barn, which took a slew so that the north wind came from the southwest. He hardly ever looked at the Sears Roebuck's catalogues anymore. And after Mr. Decameron came to visit us, suggested that Andrew write a book on country poems, the man became simply unbearable. And all the time I was counting eggs and turning out 3 meals a day and running the farm when Andrew got a literary fit and go off on some vagabond jaunt to collect adventures for a new book. I wish you could have seen the state he was in when he came back from these trips, hoboing it along the roads without any money or a clean sock to his back. One time he returned with a cough you could hear the other side of the barn, and I had to nurse him for 3 weeks. When someone wrote a little booklet about the Sage of Redfield and described me as a rural Zen type and the domestic balance wheel that kept the great writer close to homely realities of life, I made up my mind to give Andrew some of his own medicine. And that's my story.